kilos a year. Or 22 pounds. That's how much chocolate the average person in Switzerland eats every year. And you thought you ate a lot. It all kind of adds up when you consider that milk chocolate was a Swiss invention. Also, Switzerland is a top chocolate maker. But this industry has a dark side. And I don't mean dark chocolate. More than 1.5 million children work on cocoa farms in West Africa. That's where most of the cocoa that's used to make our chocolate comes from. I'm Susan Masika, and this is the Swiss Connection. There's been a lot of effort on the part of governments, chocolate companies, and NGOs to stop child labor in cocoa, but it's still a problem. I've been talking about this with a colleague of mine, Anand Chandrasekhar. He reports on multinational companies and the impact of their supply chains on people and the environment. This gives him lots of insight into the everyday products that a lot of us take for granted. For this episode, Anand and I went to a Swiss supermarket to see how easy or hard it is to figure out whether a package of chocolate has been produced ethically.
So here we are in Co-op City, in the Swiss capital Bern, hunting for child labor-free chocolate. What do you think? Are we going to find anything?
You'd think we would. I mean, it's such a big selection.
Let's have a look.
What about these over here with all the green hearts, Naturaplan and organic?
They've got a fair trade label on it. Now that probably means that they paid a minimum price for the cocoa that was used in making of this chocolate. That doesn't mean it's a fair price, but it's a little bit more than what the market rates are. And I know that fair trade also follows certain regulations regarding child labor. So nobody under 15 has worked on a cocoa farm to make this chocolate. Nobody under 18 has worked there without going to school. So
that's quite a good promise, isn't it? Oh, after 8. Now I'm curious to see what the label is on those. That is Nestle after 8. Okay, so they've got the Nestle
Cocoa Plan. But just looking at Cocoa Plan, I have no idea whether children were involved in the making of this chocolate or no. So it's, from a consumer point of view, it doesn't say much.
But there's a website there. What does that say? NestleCocoaPlan.com. So we could look at that after. Seeing all this chocolate and talking about it, I'm starting to get a bit hungry. I might actually need to have a bit before we go back to the studio, Anand.
I understand there's so many varieties of chocolates on so many supermarket shelves, and there's so many labels. Even the experts will be confused. So let's go back to the studio and see the journey that these chocolates have taken to get here.
Well, Anand, that was harder than I thought it would be. It's just not really possible to make an informed decision. We didn't see any labels that specifically said no child labor was in this product.
Yeah, it's not easy at all. I was talking to an expert named James Sumberg, who works on African rural youth employment. And even he agreed that chocolate labels need a revamp.
I mean, given a choice, I'll always buy a fair trade or a rainforest alliance or I'll always do that. So I think what you'd want to say is that everyone along the chain of this, the value chain, if you will, of this chocolate bar, made enough money to not live in poverty. Let me put it that way. So some words like that. And that would go a long way. It would go a very long way, I think, to stopping the exploitative side of child labor.
And who gets to decide what the price of the cocoa is and how much the farmer gets for it?
Well, it's a bit complicated. Cocoa is a global commodity. And by that I mean it's produced in one part of the world and it's transported to another part of the world. So demand and supply play a big role in deciding global prices for cocoa. But the problem is there are only very few big players in this industry, which means they have a lot of power and they can decide kind of what share the farmer is going to get of that slice.
Yeah, and some of the biggest players are these American food companies like Mars and Hershey. And of course, there are Swiss names too.
Yeah, there are some really big Swiss names. In fact, the biggest ones that come to mind are Nestle and Lindt. which are these huge chocolate companies in Switzerland. But there's also another kind of company called a commodity firm. So these commodity firms, what they do is they buy a lot of the cocoa beans from places like West Africa. They transport them all the way to places like Switzerland, where they're then processed and transformed into different products, raw materials for chocolate like cocoa butter or cocoa powder, which then the chocolate manufacturers buy off them and use them to make the chocolate that we find in supermarkets. So one such big commodity firm in Switzerland is Barry Callebaut. It's one of the biggest in the world, and it's a very big player in cocoa. So you can see, if you look at the commodity firms, if you look at the chocolate manufacturers, there are very few players involved, which means they can keep the prices down and keep the slice that the farmer gets very small as well.
Well, that's certainly very interesting. And yeah, you can see that the price would really be driven down if there are only a few players involved. But what's this all got to do with child labor?
I mean, you just have to consider a farmer growing cocoa in Ghana or the Ivory Coast. Because of the low amount of money that he or she gets from selling cocoa beans to commodity companies, there's not enough left over to pay for their children to go to school. This means that instead of going to school, the children have to work harvesting cocoa pods, transporting cocoa pods, or drying cocoa, and they miss out on an education. So, in effect, they're almost forced to work because of the low prices that are given to them by these companies.
And that sound you're hearing now is of a family working in Burkina Faso. That was recorded for Swiss public television in a documentary. And as you can hear, it's a tough life for many children in West Africa. You can hear them schlepping those heavy sacks and hacking the pods open. And it's media reports like this that have really helped raise awareness of the issue.
Yeah, and let's not forget, the child labor existed in Europe and in places like Switzerland as well. If you take the case of foster children, many of them were sent to work on farms up until the 1980s, in fact. People believe that it would be good for these children, usually from very deprived families, to learn how to work so that they would be able to support themselves when they grew up and not be a burden on society.
But these kids were basically indentured servants, and this went on until the 1980s. But finally, it was in 2016 that the Swiss parliament decided it would pay the victims about $300 million in compensation. So right there, you had the Swiss authorities admitting that it was wrong for these children to be working.
I mean, that's true, but for my story, I want to learn more about when it's actually okay for these children to work. James, the expert on African rural employment, he explained a bit about the nuance to me.
Children all over the world work. I mean, I worked as a kid. I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't work as a child, whether it was, whatever it was doing, mowing lawns or, whatever, working on the farm. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's a learning experience. It's part of growing up. Where you get into trouble is when that becomes exploitation, or when it means that children are being used in a way which is really hindering their development as opposed to promoting their development.
So international organizations like the International Labor Organization, they're kind of clear about what constitutes child labor. So there are mainly two factors that they take into account. One is the child should not perform any harmful activities, and the other is whatever work they do should not interfere with their schooling. So these are the two main pillars on which the definition of child labor rests. Then, of course, there are various conventions that deal with the minimum age that children should be allowed to work, as well as the most hazardous forms of child labor.
Well, that sounds like the bare minimum to ensure child welfare.
Yeah, you would think so, but there are experts like James who are wary about imposing demands on poorer countries that are not really practical given the real life situation over there.
One of the big issues is that, if you go to poor rural areas, the school provision that's available there can be of very low quality. So then you have to say, well, is the child really better off spending time in a school where the education is very low quality, and it's a girl child, she may well be harassed and come to harm, either getting to school or while she's in school. She's really better off in that situation than learning how to farm or learning how to do, work with her mother or brother or father, whatever it is. So it's never as straightforward as that simple idea of childhood's about going to school and playing and having a good time, really, and that work doesn't fit in there.
And there are others who are even against the very concept of child labor, like Neil Howard of the University of Bath in England. He's got some rather strong views about the subject, especially about the right of children to work if they want to.
Child labor is not a thing. It's not a real thing. It's not something that ordinary living people experience or refer to themselves as experiencing. People around the world talk about work, and they talk about work that is good or bad, beneficial or harmful. The concept of child labor has been cooked up by well-meaning politicians, largely in the West, alongside particularly the ILO, primarily as an effort or as part of an effort to protect children, but fundamentally in a fashion that doesn't involve consulting them.
So experts like Howard and James, they want to make this clear distinction between child labor and children's work. And for them, it's okay for children to work as long as they get a net benefit from it. So if they benefit overall from working, even if there are certain downsides, it's fine for them to be working if they want to work.
Picking cocoa pods is not only an economic necessity, it's actually a vital life skill for them to survive, given that cocoa farming is probably going to be the work that they end up doing. That's point number one. Point number two is, cocoa farming is not hard work. I have worked with young people across West Africa who have done a variety of different jobs, and I have been told by huge numbers of them that cocoa farming is one of the easier jobs out there.
Yeah, but isn't that letting the chocolate companies off the hook? I mean, should children really be harvesting cocoa pods with sharp tools like machetes and cutlasses?
I think it all depends on the context here. You'll have to see what's happening on the ground. Do the kids have the right tools? Do they have the right protective and equipment? Are they being monitored or supervised by an adult? Are they getting regular breaks? Are they getting nutritious food to give them the energy to work? So you have to look at all these things to see whether or not they're being exploited or if the work they're doing is harmful. So it's very difficult to kind of judge the situation unless you know what's really happening there.
Is the child under some draconian piecework regime where he's got to crack 1,000 cocoa pods before noontime or he won't be fed his lunch? That's one thing. If the kid has just wandered over because his mother and his father and his older brother and sister are cracking cocoa pods and he sits down and picks up the cutlass and cracks a couple of pods because he wants to feel part of the family and he wants to feel, or she wants to feel, that she's contributing, that's a completely different story. But if you just take the photo, what do you see? You see child, cutlass, and cocoa pod.
One thing to keep in mind is that most children working in the cocoa sector, they're working on their family farms. So the number is pretty high. It's about 94% of them are working on their own family's cocoa farms. So it's really about have a need of the family to bring in the money that they need to survive. And it's not really about children being exploited for somebody else's profit.
But what about the other 6%? I mean, you say 94% are working on the family farms, but the other ones? That documentary that we heard from earlier, it included a child who'd essentially been kidnapped so that he could work on another family's farm.
Yeah, it's quite clear that there are a lot of wrong practices going on. For example, in Burkina Faso, which is a much poorer country, there are a lot of children that are used as almost slave labor in neighboring Ivory Coast. So that's clearly a form of exploitation, and it's completely unacceptable. But that's an extreme case, and that's not really what we're talking about here.
The chocolate companies claim that they've invested millions in stopping child labor, but still, there are over 1.5 million kids who are working on the cocoa farms. So, has this money or effort made any difference?
I mean, it's true that chocolate companies have invested millions of dollars in monitoring child labor situation on cocoa farms. But it's very difficult to compare whether this has made a difference or not because of the very nature of the studies that have been done. Many of them have used different methodologies, so it's difficult to compare. Cocoa cultivation has expanded, so there are more cocoa grown, so it's more likely that more children will be involved in there as well. So there are all these difficult issues that make it quite difficult to compare. But there has been some progress, applying all this pressure on chocolate companies and this increased investment in cocoa growing areas has resulted in a higher school attendance of children. For example, in Ivory Coast, the school attendance increased from 58% to 80% in the last 10 years, which is quite a significant increase. So the money has made a difference to cocoa growing areas, compared to other parts of the country. And I would even go as far to say that the children working in cocoa are the lucky ones.
Really? But how can you say that when most of them are doing heavy and dangerous work?
Well, if you look globally at child labor, the cocoa industry accounts for only 1% of the child labor that's out there. The vast majority of child labor is found outside the cocoa industry. So we are talking about subsistence farming, like growing maize or cassava. Also, in certain sectors like domestic servants, a lot of children are made to work as domestic servants in many parts of the world. And also in the services sector, you have a lot of children working, if you look at hotels and restaurants. So these are the areas where you find the majority of child labor. And the cocoa industry only accounts for 1%.
Well, speaking of figures, there was one in your article that really caught my eye. You wrote that child labor had dropped by about 40% between the years 2000 and 2016. That was according to the ILO. It sounds like real progress.
Yeah, it is real progress if you consider that, people have been fighting child labor for a century. To achieve that kind of progress in such a short period of time has to be commended. Another positive development is that people are starting to look beyond cocoa and beyond commodities. They are realizing that a farmer growing cocoa in Ghana is also growing other crops like maize or something else. And that children in those villages might not be working on cocoa, but they might be working on other crops. So they're starting to look beyond cocoa and see what's happening around in the neighborhood and the vicinity of cocoa farms and kind of adopting a more holistic approach to the problem.
Well, they've got until the year 2025, because that's the deadline to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goal of ending child labor.
Yeah, that's a target, to focus energy and to concentrate resources on. Sometimes you need a clear target that motivates people and countries and companies to try and put a lot of effort in a very short period of time to push the needle forward. So that's kind of what the target is all about.
And I think a lot of us will be looking at our chocolate wrappers more closely now. Which reminds me, what sort of labels should we be looking for? Can you maybe name a few international ones that we can trust?
Well, there are a few big international ones like Germany-based Fairtrade or the US-based Rainforest Alliance or the Dutch-based UTZ. These are some of the big ones that follow the International Labour Organization's guidelines on minimum age. So they kind of try and ensure that children below, say, 13 to 15 years of age are not involved in the making of your chocolate bar. But it's kind of impossible to guarantee that no children were involved at all in the whole process, because these are audits that are conducted, a few times a year, and it's very difficult to completely eliminate children from the supply chain.
And are there labels that allow children under 13 to work?
Well, there's a Swiss-based label called Fair for Life. They allow children under 12 to work, but they should be working on their family farms. And, they should only be doing light work, not more than 2 hours, and they should be going to school. So there are some labels that allow children to work under certain conditions, young children to work under certain conditions.
Well, that sounds more in line with the sort of chores that a lot of kids around the world do at home. Thanks for bringing us this story, Anand.
You're welcome.
Now, for more information, you can visit us at swissinfo.ch. And while you're there, let us know how labels influence your shopping habits. And coming up on swissinfo.ch, we've got a story on artificial chocolate. So that's chocolate made in the lab. So definitely follow us on social media to keep an eye out for that story. The Swiss Connection is a Swissinfo production. We tell Swiss stories for the world every 2 weeks. This episode was reported by Anand Chandrasekhar and produced by Anand and me, Susan Masika. Our studio engineer is Danny Wheeler. And our music was composed by our colleague Michele Andina. Thanks for listening.
Do you want to polish your knowledge about Swiss elections, referendums, and political parties, while at the same time learning more about the quirks of the political system in Switzerland? If that's the case, our newsletter course is just what you need. Each week for a month, we'll send you a free installment explaining the most important details of how Swiss democracy works. Our course teaches you who is eligible to vote in Switzerland, what the different parties stand for, how election and popular vote results are implemented, and what distinguishes Swiss democracy from other political systems. Our crash course is interactive, like democracy itself. Your questions will be answered on an FAQ page, and you can debate with other users and share your inputs and opinions. We will also provide links to multimedia articles and videos to help you better understand the Swiss democratic system. Please join us and sign up for the free Democracy Crash Course newsletter at www.swissinfo.ch/democracy. That's www.swissinfo.ch/democracy.